In our last episode, we talked about what it looks like to be a healthy overseer or elder in the life of the church. And I want us to realize that those definitions, those terms are, again, interchangeable. We see that in Titus as well as in Acts 20, that overseer, elder language really seems to describe one function, one role, one responsibility in the life of the church. We come today to a second role of responsibility. And we can recognize from other passages there are other roles, right? Apostle as well as pastor and teacher. But when it comes to what we see consistently, whether that be in Philippians or Acts, as well as now in the pastoral epistles, is that often two primary roles of leadership were set up in the early church so that the church could be healthy. And that second role is a role that we often call a deacon. And I want us to understand this dynamic about this particular word. This is a Greek transliteration of the word. So in other words, the Greek word sounds like this English word deacon. Here's the problem with that, is that if I were to ask the average person, or even some of my own kids, what does a deacon do? What is a deacon? I ask this every semester as 30 new students walk into my classroom, 30 or so new students. I ask, what does a deacon do? And I kid you not, there's only a handful of students who often have a firm grasp of what a deacon in the New Testament does. Now, sometimes they know what deacons do in their own church, but really this connotation of what this concept, what this word is oftentimes lost because it's not a word that we have in the English language. It's just a transliteration of a word. Now, obviously then we have our own nuances of what it means. But in the first century word, I say that to say this, in the first century world, when I said, or when Paul said the word deacon, they immediately knew what this role was and what the responsibilities were. Now, maybe not all the details, but it's similar to, like, if I would say the word mechanic, you know what a mechanic does. You know what the role is and their responsibilities, what they generally are. If I say the word carpenter, you understand what a carpenter is and what a carpenter does. So if I were to do that kind of opening, what is a carpenter? What is a mechanic? What is a deacon? You would actually go, oh, wait, it's not as easy. That's why it's also interesting then that we get the word minister from this word. So the word minister or ministry comes from the Greek word deacon, and this is really just the Latin translation of the Greek word. And then we've just taken the Latin word and we've put the English sounds together and transliterated that into English. And again, I'm oversimplifying this a bit, but what we have here is kind of a synonym that at times then, when it comes to how we live this out in the life of the church today, is this may actually be a completely different role. And we may ask the question on the street, what does a minister do? And individuals may know exactly what a minister does, but it may not be a one-to-one correlation of what the first century world thought a minister did. Let me go one step further. We actually then have, I'm going to use the phrase servant. Maybe you can add the word servant leader or servant volunteer here. And this word servant then becomes a form of translation, not transliteration, but translation of the Greek word deacon. What were deacons in the first century world? So let me come back to this original question. What were deacons? Well, deacons were individuals who served, oftentimes by waiting on tables, serving food. A waitress, a waiter is maybe an idea, a connotation we would have. But sometimes it actually was in the household of the god, like an idol. A deacon in a temple, in a pagan temple, was a servant who served the god, sacrifices and meals, but also then served the people who came to worship. So this word deacon in the ancient world had connotations not only in the temples of the greater world, but also then in a household, waiting on tables and serving the needs of the family, and then in the temple itself, as in like Israel, Jerusalem's temple. And so we actually lose some of those connotations when we translate it one of the three of each of these ways. Immediately, they would have understood what a deacon does. So what would I recommend we do? Well, first of all, just gain understanding. But this is why sometimes in the church we're confused. Like, what is the role of a minister? Well, it depends on what you mean. Do you mean like senior minister, the one who teaches primarily, is the primary doctrinal teacher? Or do you actually mean someone who's then serving needs, maybe financial needs, or maybe they're meeting the needs of the physical building? What does that actually look like? Now, part of the genius of the New Testament, part of the genius of God in his household is that these roles have a function and responsibility, but not a detail of how that plays out. Well, like those who serve may actually serve in different ways, in different capacities, depending on, the size of your church, the location of your church. Do you need to shovel snow? Okay, you might need someone who just shovels snow. But maybe you live by the beach and you need someone who does something completely different. So the dynamics here are interesting for us to be able to play out when it comes to even practically what it is that these individuals do. Let me say this, like I said in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, talking about elders. But Paul's primary concern is not what do they do, but who are they? Because if they have that character of Christ, then they will figure out how to serve like Christ and do the things that Christ would have them do. I mean, it's not really, all that far to see that these individuals are actually called to look like Jesus because they're called to be servants. So, I don't know, at some level recognize that the elders, overseers are responsible for the primary teaching of doctrine in the life of the church. And the servants then actually lead and live that out in the godliness and good works in the life of the church. But even in doing that, what are they doing? They are teaching what it looks like to look like Jesus. They're discipling others. And then in turn, that calls others to see who Jesus is. It upholds truth in the life of the community. So I don't know, do deacons, ministers, servants in your church community, do they serve like Jesus? Or do they meet in meetings and make decisions on committees? I mean, again, what portrait are we painting? Remember what we said about this portrait? Is the portrait can either be a New Testament picture that Paul paints, that the Bible paints, or it can be a portrait of kind of our version of Christianity. And we can actually slap a biblical label on it. Let's slap the label overseer, pastor. Let's slap the label on it, deacon, but let's actually paint the picture into our own image. So the image looks like someone who's really good at handling finances. Well, maybe we do need someone who's really good at handling finances, but maybe they're a lover of money. So the heart of this individual really does matter. Paul's primary concern is their character, not necessarily the details of what they do. Again, who are they before what they do in the life of the community? So notice, deacons likewise, notice that word likewise there in verse 8, chapter 3, verse 8. Likewise is actually a parallel word that says, like the elders, deacons likewise must be, and here's this word, dignified. Now, in the last session, we said that this portrait has a title, that if you're going to go into an art exhibit, you oftentimes see a title of a portrait or a picture. The portrait of the elders was above reproach. And that's similar to this word. In fact, it's somewhat synonymous the way these words were used in the first century world of individuals, whether that be individuals for a political office or a role in a household. They must be someone who's not fake, someone who's authentic, must be in this sense dignified. We'll see blameless in the letter to Titus. So the functionality here is the same. The portrait is of someone who is who they say they are. And so we see some of the same terminology. They must not be double-tongued, not addicted to wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. What's Paul saying there? Well, the word mystery, if you study that word that Paul uses, it's actually not a mystery anymore. It's actually been uncovered. When Jesus came, he actually unveiled the mystery, which is what's the Messiah going to look like? What's he going to do? And Paul, in his own journey, was blind, and then Jesus appeared to him, and he literally saw. And I think Jesus goes, oh, that's what it was. Jesus came, and if you study the word mystery, oftentimes Paul says about this about Jesus. Jesus came and he was crucified. Didn't see that coming. Jesus came and he accepted the Gentiles. Didn't see that coming. Jesus came and he united the Jews and Gentiles into one church. Didn't see that coming. Jesus came and he is going to bring us to a place of a new creation. Okay, saw that coming, but not in the timing that we have in the New Testament. So Paul uses that word to somewhat summarize the gospel that is unveiled in Jesus. And so what must the deacons do? Well, they must hold on to this mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, with the right motivations. So nothing all that surprising there. Verse 10, let them be tested first. Well, notice again, what are we testing them for? Are they blameless? Not are they perfect, not are they Jesus, but are they who they say they are? Are they someone in the life of the church that we could say, hey, we're gonna set them up as an example of someone who serves, and then they're going to lead other people to serve like them. And in other people serving like them, they're going to look more like Jesus, and we're going to look more like Jesus. And that's going to lead to the witness of the church. You see, if your servant leaders, your ministers, your deacons, whatever you call them, don't have people that they are then discipling under them to learn these particular tasks. So if they don't have, I don't know how many people underneath them, if they don't have a few people underneath them learning that task, then they're probably not making disciples. Now, they might be one of these small S's, but I don't know I'd put them in this role. Because the role and responsibility of this is actually to lead the family in these tasks and in this outpouring of what it looks like to serve like Jesus. So this dynamic is they must be tested. Like, let's make sure we know who they are. If that's true, if they are who they say they are, then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves, there's another word, blameless. Then we go on, verse 11. Their wives, notice the phrase, likewise. Now we get into a question that we have in this particular text. It's kind of a difficult passage again, like what we saw in chapter 2, and we'll see again in other passages on different topics. There's a translation question that we have in verse 11. The ESV has translated this, their wives likewise must be dignified. Now I want you to see that word likewise there. Paul's already used that. Elders, likewise, deacons, likewise, now their wives as a possible translation. In fact, we could go all the way back to chapter 2. Men must pray. Likewise, women must be dressed according to this standard of modesty, according to their wealth and social status. And so this word likewise has put different conversations in parallel conversations with one another. But what's the other possible translation? Well, the other possible translation is more generically, women must be, or even the possible supplied insinuation, deaconesses must be. Now, it's one of those three options. Paul is either in verse 11 talking about the wives of deacons, or he's talking about women who are deaconesses, and you can then supply it as generally women must be, or you could supply it as, go ahead and just supply the word deaconesses must be. Here's the reason why maybe Paul didn't use the word deaconesses. The feminine use of the word deaconesses wasn't in use, as far as we know, in the first century world, in Paul's time frame. So oftentimes when the word deacon was used of someone who was a female servant in even say a pagan temple, the masculine term would be used for them. And so Paul could have done a couple things. He could have made up a feminine ending to the word and supplied it in the Greek. He could have done that. But kind of like the word mechanic, it could be male or female. Paul didn't do that. And yet in parallel with this phrase, therefore, likewise, women must be, it might be that Paul is saying these are those who are deaconesses. Now, let's keep unpacking just a bit and let's maybe try to land on an option of one of those three. So again, ESV says, their wives likewise must be dignified. Now notice that Paul again's putting a portrait, must be, and then he supplies a label to that portrait. That's kind of interesting that Paul does that, even if it's how the ESV translated their wives, because he didn't do that with the elders. So why would Paul have a portrait of what a wife of a deacon should look like if he doesn't do that with the wives of those who are the overseers and primary teachers of doctrine in the life of the church? It's just kind of interesting. Maybe we could ask him someday, but maybe that's something for us to take and weigh in our consideration of how to understand this verse. Notice then he continues, not slanderers, but sober-minded and faithful in all things. Then Paul comes back to verse 12 and says, let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and households well. For those who serve as well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also a great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. In other words, in the life of the community and the life of the witness, like they stand out as people that others go, I want to be like them. So which is it? Is it the wives of the deacons, or is it more specifically deaconesses that Paul's talking about here? Well, I want to play a little bit of that activity that game that we played in 1 Timothy 2. What do we observe? What do we not observe? A couple things that we observe. Number one, in context, Paul goes on right in verse 12 and talks about those who are deacons being the husbands of one wife. So that's why the ESV translates it their wives, because the immediate context there seems to infer the husband and wife relationship. However, let's also go other places. Let's play the game. What do we observe? What do we not observe? We could go to Romans chapter 12, and we could look at Phoebe, who is called now, depending on your translation, she's called a minister or a servant or a deacon, depending on how you translate that same word in that context. She's called a servant of the church of Cenchreae, or a deaconess of the church of Cenchreae, or a servant leader, a minister of the church of Cenchreae. Again, all of that becomes very complicated because of how we in the church, in our churches, have sometimes separated these out, right? Like deacons don't do the same thing ministers do. One is maybe on staff and one is maybe a volunteer. And sometimes deacons don't do the same thing servant leaders do. These people maybe meet as a committee, maybe even a business committee or a facilities committee. And yet these people, maybe they serve the homeless, or maybe they serve the widows, or maybe they take food to those who are elderly. And so it's interesting to me that we've broken this out in different ways. And yet maybe I'd go as like all of them are actually deacons, ministers, servants in their own way. Like this is how God created it to happen, is we have these servant leaders serving in certain capacities. Now, if that's true, I also find it interesting that in some of our churches, we would say, well, yes, we have ladies in our church serving in this capacity, but maybe not in this capacity or this capacity. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, again, you heard my heart. I want to be consistent. This is actually the same Greek word. And so if it's, kind of unfortunate that we would go, oh, well, they can serve in this role, but not this one and this one, when it's exactly the same Greek word. So I want to be consistent. Romans chapter 16 has Phoebe serving as a servant leader of the church of Cenchreae. And I go, I observe something there, is that she is given this particular title, if you will, or at least responsibility, and she's described as someone who is doing this task in the life of that church. That's why I like responsibility language rather than title language. And the same thing would be true of what we didn't observe with those who are elders and overseers in chapter 2. So when it comes to this particular role, let me go a few other places with it. When it comes to the early church, what do we observe? What do we not observe? Well, early on in the early church, we actually see the feminine Latin use of this word describing a few ladies in the church who were servants of the church, ministers of the church, deaconesses in the church, who were actually martyred for their faith. And this title, this description, this task, this responsibility is a label that's used to describe who they were in the community in which they lived. It's not the final end all of the argument, but I go, that's significant. Because again, I want to be consistent. I played this game. I asked this question when it came to the role of overseer and elder. And I asked, what do we observe? What do we not observe in the New Testament? What do I observe? What do I not observe in the life of the early church? What's consistent? What do I observe? What do I not observe in the life of our community today? And here's the other thing that I observe in the life of our community today. Very rarely will we find a church, in fact, I don't know that I've ever met one, to where if we're honest with these labels, where we don't have women serving in this capacity of leadership in some way. And so it brings me back to this passage, and in fact, my own historical study of even my movement of churches. We start to find this ebb and flow of how we've applied this based upon kind of even the Committee Americana portrait that we sometimes paint, the political portrait that we sometimes paint of having, kind of the committee structure or the elders being the board and the deacons being part of the board. We come back to the household model, and some of those things fall apart. Because in the household, it's saying, hey, we have tasks that need done, and we need someone to lead in that. And who looks like Jesus to be able to lead in that task, to serve in that task, and will lead other people in that task. And I don't know a church to where they're not consistently men and women serving and leading in that capacity. So it leads me to, and I know that's kind of a summarization of my view, it leads me to understand verse 11 as likely be in reference to let then also women likewise be dignified, specifically speaking about those who are females serving in this capacity of the minister, servant, deacon role in the life of the church. Like I've said before, these are complicated issues and there are obviously different opinions, and I encourage you to continue to seek those out. But I also want to have an open door, open conversation with you if you have questions about these and what that might look like in your church. Let me wrap up this conversation by noticing this. In the book of Acts, we have a group of individuals who are called to care for those who are widows. And they are actually given that task because of a need, a crisis of service in the life of the church. And it's the apostles in that instance who are responsible for the primary teaching of doctrine of the church. And those 7 men, Greek men, by the way, because they're serving Greek widows in the life of that community, are brought forth as people who are above reproach, people who are good examples, full of the Spirit, wise. And they're given the task of serving literal tables of those who are widows, Greek widows, in the life of the church. And that paradigm actually becomes helpful for us. Even the word deacon, or the root word that we get deacon, servant, or serving tables, or servant, that word is found there. And that paradigm, I think, is helpful for us because that's how this role complements the role of the overseers and elders, is they both work together to help train people to be like Jesus in both the things that we teach and the way that we live and the way that we serve. And to make sure that the needs of the community are met, that it's not just the doctrinal needs or the teaching needs, because we need a healthy diet of God's word, but we also sometimes just need bread. And so it makes sure that the holistic life of the community is met. And it's in the holistic life of the health and life of this community that then we also have a holistic witness to the world around us. You see, I think these two roles are meant to complement each other. And sometimes we have complicated these issues. And some of our lack of health is because we've forgotten what we're called to be, what we're called to do. So many of our deacons and ministers find most of their time in meetings rather than in meeting needs. And like one scholar has said, maybe we ought to get our deacons out of the boardroom and to another room that's the kitchen, the family room, the table, the community, and encourage them to see the needs of the community, call them to lead other people to meet those needs, and in the process to grow to look more like Jesus as we wash one another's feet around the table of the family of God.